this morning's anger management live video. If this is your first time joining us, just to explain what we're going to be doing is bringing to you live on the topic of anger management. Issaropia Foundation, the company that we work for, has decided that current climate, mental health is really starting to come into the forefront. And what we do as an organization is to give these kind of lives and spaces to the general public, to make them available to listen, so we can start to bandy around some really good ideas and to build our knowledge perhaps of some really important mental health issues. So if you haven't met me before, my name is Charlie. Half my time doing this kind of thing, and otherwise the other half of my time, of course, is supporting the team.
I'm Emily. I'm a wellbeing coach. So I provide the workshops. I run the workshops, and if people need to have a chat and things like that. So yeah, it's just on the front end.
Yeah, on the front end, exactly. And the topics that we're going to be delivering. And really, this next time that we have together is just an opportunity for everybody to ask some questions, to share some of their thoughts potentially around the material that we're discussing as well, and otherwise just try and gain as much as you possibly can from these sessions. What we do have today are a few preloaded questions, and the way that designed the live that we do have that we might do it. But outside of that, that you want to ask, please do let us know, and we'll make sure that we address those as well. I'm just going to pause for a second because I can see if you are happy just to pause for a moment. What I'll do is make sure that we have this up and running perfectly before we go ahead, because Emily, there isn't much point us going ahead if we're not talking to anyone. So I know that you were kind of saying that anger.
Yeah, the way that I think of anger is like, so you have all of these experiences and you react to the different experiences in different ways, and you've got this little vial of glitter, and sometimes when our anger isn't managed and processed properly, it can spill, and then it just sticks to everything. You find it in places that you never knew you'd find it, and you kind of have to just get the Hoover and suck it all up and get it contained again. So yeah.
I think we're back. All right. Like I said, we did have an internet connection issue. I just had to change things around, so we've connected to a different internet source now, and that should mean that we're going to be stable for the rest of the live.
Fingers crossed.
Emily, I'm completely aware, I think, that you got cut off there for a second. Would you mind just kind of saying what you're saying about your analogy?
Yeah, so glitter it's found in different places, and you think that you spilled it on the table, but you're in your bedroom and you're finding it in your kitchen, and you're like, how did this even get here? And it can be really difficult to look at all of the different things that you're angry about and to decide what's made you angry. But I think the thing about the misconception about anger sometimes can be that it's this rage, and it's this toxic trait that everybody has and that everybody's kind of trying to work on. But actually, I think anger can sometimes be anger to yourself, and that can then manifest in different ways. And it's like the forefront of all of the negative emotions that you don't necessarily, like Charlie was saying to me, because I don't necessarily think of anger in the same way as most people, and it's not necessarily just because it's the way that it comes across normally to most people. That doesn't mean that you don't feel it. So yeah.
So I think it's a really, really nice analogy. And like you said, there are lots of different ways that people look at anger, but I like your glitter analogy, because what you're kind of implying there is there might be an original source, and then potentially something that might frustrate you, send you into a rage. It might be something that's happened recently, or it might be something that's happened a long time ago. But when it breaks up and you get all those little flecks, those little bits of glitter, they land in so many different parts of your life, and actually it will start to affect you potentially in so many different situations. And I think it ties in quite nicely actually to that first question that we've got on screen there. How has anger affected your life today? I think the bottom line is that it can affect it in a huge, huge number of ways. I know we were having quite a transparent chat before where you were saying that you don't necessarily identify as someone that...
I don't feel like an angry person. I don't feel like for most of my life I've been surrounded by people who can get angry quite quickly, and for people who can be triggered and then that escalates from 0 to 100 quite quickly. So I learned that anger didn't get me anywhere, and it wasn't a productive emotion. So I just kind of stopped myself from feeling angry and trying to direct that frustration into different outlets. But I guess it's like you said, it doesn't necessarily mean that I don't feel angry. It's just it doesn't look the same way for me. And I think that's the beauty and the travesty about mental illness, is that for every single person that feels one emotion, whether that's sadness or anger or anxiety, it looks different for everyone because of the way that they identify with it. And yeah, it's not really how you see anger on the TV always. It's sometimes different, and it can be internal anger and it can be external anger.
Exactly. I think that's a really good way of looking at it. And I know I was speaking to one of our coaches, Tom, who, if you've come through his rope, you might have had the pleasure of meeting at some point. And he was saying he had a very deep realization that he'd never considered himself an angry person until, funny enough, he presented one of the workshops that we do, and he had a deep realization that there are so many different ways that anger can present. For a lot of people, we have this idea that anger is something that's quite external. It might be flipping tables, it might be shouting, it might be being passive aggressive, it might be avoiding certain things or situations, but
it's not always.
It's not, is it?
Because it can be tearfulness. You can, like, I'm a massive, if I feel like someone's betrayed me or something, I'll cry, and that may be my way of showing that I'm angry, and then maybe yours is completely different.
Yeah, exactly.
And
I
that's
think
okay.
we don't always just have one response as well to our anger. That's the thing. I know that sometimes, thankfully not often, I hope anyway, I can be a little bit strong with my words in particular, but as well I might take my anger out on myself as well. And this is anger potentially that might stem from, just a little thing that's bothered me during the day, something that's crossed one of my core values maybe. But also I know in the past I was really, really resentful and angry for a whole load of missed opportunities that I had. Some of it was my fault. If I look back with hindsight, I can see that I didn't take the opportunities that were given to me. But a few other opportunities as well were ones that were taken from me. And actually anger can be a really natural part of the loss and grief process as well. If we're mourning our past selves, mourning a person, mourning a loss of job, lifestyle change, the list really can go on. But the bottom line is that if we hang on to anger, it's almost like a poison, I would say.
That glitter just keeps on spreading and expanding and taking over everything that you had that was good in your life. It taints it in a different way. Yeah,
exactly. And I know that glitter's a really nice way of looking at it, but it's not a nice coloured glitter, is it?
No, it's like a
brown.
Yeah, it's like an ugly glitter.
It's an ugly glitter. But that's it. But fundamentally, we can carry that anger with us, and it can affect us going into the future as well. And all potentially because of something that happened days, weeks, years ago.
Yeah.
I think it's our duty to ourselves at this point to learn to let go of what can be quite an unhelpful feeling.
It can stunt our growth as human beings. We're constantly trying to learn. Like as an organisation, we're a service for change. We're constantly trying to make ourselves better, and whether that's in our health or whether that's in the kind of person we are. Like every single person is constantly trying to be the best version of themselves. And if you let your anger stunt you, and you let your anger consume you, then you're not able to move forward as easily, because there's always going to be that roadblock of anger. So it's hard. It can be really hard to let go of those things that you feel have been forced on you. Like you were saying that you were angry at your missed opportunities. You're constantly looking at the missed opportunities, then you're going to miss more opportunities because you're so focused on what you've already missed. And it's just going to be a vicious cycle.
Exactly. I think it's well known as well that anger can actually be the basis of a lot of really common mental health issues, depression for one, as well. And I know that certainly when I was struggling with my own depression, anger, although not maybe obvious to a lot of people, it was something that was keeping me locked really firmly into the past. Wasn't taking responsibility for anything, and I felt like I was really stuck in the story as well.
Because sometimes people get so overwhelmed with anger and they're not in control of that necessarily, it can then bring other emotions like shame and guilt and sadness, and then that turns in on yourself, and you're like, oh, I wish I didn't get so angry because that makes me a bad person because I lost my temper. And it perpetuates everything that you might be feeling towards another situation, and it turns it in on yourself because you can't forgive yourself for losing your temper or harming yourself out of frustration, and not necessarily harming yourself physically, but harming yourself, putting yourself in harm's way because you're so angry.
So there's a word for what you just described there. Secondary disturbance. I think it's called that. Sorry if I've just paraphrased it and got it wrong. But the concept that we can give ourselves even further emotional anguish when we start to feel guilty or ashamed because we had an emotion in the first place. One emotion leads to a whole bunch of other ones. So anger, really, really important, right? Really important that we get to understand it a little bit. And what I'd like to do, just being mindful of the pacing of this workshop as well, is that we just have a little look-see at some of the really common misconceptions about anger, because I do think it's really heavily misunderstood. The first one, I want to be really, really clear about this. Anger is not necessarily a negative emotion. Actually, it's really, really helpful in a lot of situations. I mean, no, you mentioned, Emily, that can motivate, can't it?
Yeah, I think if you use it, anger has such a tendency to be kind of like this untamable beast. But if you figure out how to tame it and you figure out how to use it to your advantage, then you can really create amazing things from anger. And that motivation for change can look like anger quite a lot of the time because you're frustrated at the lack of change.
Exactly. Anger and every emotion that we feel, especially the painful negative emotions that we feel, they're always there to communicate to us that a need isn't being met in some way, shape or form. And in particular, anger, when we feel it, it's usually for very good reasons. It might be that there's something that goes against our core values, who it is that we are. Just to give you a really ridiculous example around this, I consider myself quite British, for better or for worse, and queue jumping. Right, queue jumping sends me into a rage. Even just thinking about it gets me.
Left-hand lane overtaking.
Yeah.
But why would you do that?
Why? Undertaking is. I'm going to stop myself there. We'll come on to what I just did there to stop myself getting angry a bit later on. But anger is not necessarily a negative emotion. It tells us that something goes against our very core essence sometimes, and it's really important in life that we respect our individuality and that we strive to match a life that matches us potentially as well. But just to give you an example, because exactly like you say, if we harness our anger well, it does lead to positive change. And this isn't necessarily a well-known fact, but Isopia itself, the company that I work for, is in essence initially born out of healthy anger. we saw that there was a gap in the market. We saw that we had our own frustrations as well, potentially with some people around the Isle of Wight falling through the cracks in the services. And out of that frustration, out of that anger, we harnessed it to make something better. We found a solution.
And I think as well, if you dug deep, and I'm sure everyone here at Isopia would probably agree with me, I'm not going to speak for them, but for me, especially when I was recovering, I was angry at myself for being in a situation that I was having to recover from. But I used that anger as motivation, and I used that frustration at myself to really learn about myself and to really learn how I work and what I need in life. And therefore that anger has led to me opening so many more doors and being the person that I am today. So it's okay to have felt that anger about myself and that all of those negative emotions that I felt about my mental illness, to then be able to step back and think, okay, well, what do I need to do to make myself better? So
yeah, exactly. Again, a really, really positive emotion in that case.
Yeah.
Anger does teach us a lot about ourselves as well. Sometimes, and other people. Yes, you're right. You can always learn a lot about another person based on their anger.
And how they put those emotions on you. If you're in a relationship or you have someone in your life that causes you to feel so much anger, you can actually learn a lot about them. Because you can learn what your triggers are in that environment. You can learn about, well, why did they make me so angry? What is going on for them to provoke such a reaction in me? And it can be really enlightening. I
think you're absolutely right on that one. Anger is almost always a representation of the individual and their kind of opinions and their reality as well. It's very rarely the situation itself, but more about that individual right there. I think just while we keep our focus on some misconceptions about anger as well, there is this kind of theory out there that venting your anger, whether that's screaming into a pillow or punching a punching bag, for instance, is a good way to manage anger. And although it might give you that kind of short-term release, I can promise you it isn't necessarily the healthiest way to be managing your anger. Often if we're angry, there is a deeper kind of core issue that might need addressing. And the unfortunate fact, and this is really relevant to mental health as well, is that if we go for that instant gratification, that really easy way of trying to manage that emotion in the short term, it will help, but it will resurface further down the line.
And probably worse.
And often, unfortunately, often in a bigger way. So venting off our anger does sometimes help in the short term, but it really isn't a long-term solution. Suppressing your anger is better. No. I'm glad you shook your head. I said that in a convincing way.
Yeah, I do. I think I and have always been, because I guess I pride myself on being a calm influence on other people. So it's like I feel that barrier about feeling angry and feeling the ability to show my anger, and it takes a lot for me to show my anger, so that when I feel angry, I'm like, well, you can't feel that. You're not allowed to feel that. That's not part of you. So then it comes back different, but it comes back differently. It doesn't go away. It just translates into a different emotion, or it translates into unhealthy coping mechanisms or things like that. And it's no way near the best way to deal with anger. It's probably one of the worst, I'd say.
Exactly. Bearing it, compartmentalizing it, suppressing it. No, all of our emotions are important, as much as sometimes we don't really want to look at them. They are always important, and bringing them out into the light is certainly the way to do that as well. Another misconception: I can't help it. I was born this way. If this was a podcast, it'd be terrible us just shaking our heads. Thankfully, you can see us as well. No. So, okay, of course, genetics do play a little bit of a part in how it is that we are. That's the old nature versus nurture kind of question, isn't it? But what is much more likely when it comes to anger is that you've learned to role model certain ways of coping, perhaps, or certain values from your parents, your childhood influences, the people around you. Often it isn't necessarily an issue with genetics, but much more about the way that we've learned to manage it.
And it comes back to that effective communication workshop that we always that we do. It's not necessary. It's learning that, okay, this person was angry, and then therefore they met they got their needs met. Therefore, that's the only way that I can get my needs met. Whereas actually, that's not necessarily the reason why they got their needs. It probably wasn't a long-lasting way to get their needs. It was born out of maybe fear or appeasement or things like that. So it's not something that is necessarily something that you want to learn as a coping mechanism, but unfortunately we are beings of copying each other. And
that's it. And I really like what you're mentioning there, because often in dysfunctional families, we can see that people might have seen that either their parents or other people get their needs met by being really quite overtly angry. They scream, they kick up, they make a fuss. People don't really want to get involved in that conflict. They give them what they need, and we can learn for ourselves that that is a good and appropriate way of getting our needs met. Just a quick caveat, when I say dysfunctional families, I personally believe every family is dysfunctional. So yeah, don't think too hard around that one there. But certainly, anger, if we're using it to get our needs met, it comes at a great cost, not just for ourselves as well. The emotional toll, it starts to affect us physically as well. But also, I can promise you that anger is more likely to alienate people. And in the worst situations as well, if you're angry at someone, it can actually encourage them to go directly against you and your cause as well.
And anger promotes anger. I feel like people they may meet your needs, but they won't want to, and they won't feel like they can be in your life in a positive way. They'll feel negatively as well. So it's a difficult one, because it can almost be an automatic response, because we're trying to protect ourselves. All of our emotions are signals, and we're basically just navigating our way through life trying to survive, and our emotions are a massive part of our survival. So it can be what's conceived to be automatic, but there is that ability to stop yourself and say, okay, do I need to be angry right now, or do I need to be assertive right now? And there's a difference.
Thank you. I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because that is another misconception. Aggression and assertiveness, they're not the same thing. If you're being assertive, which is, to be fair, it's a fine grey line. It's really hard to find that line, somewhere between being passive and aggressive. But if you're assertive, you're respecting your own needs. You're respecting another person's needs as well, though. It is kind of the act of being assertive as to what it is that you will and won't tolerate, being willing to compromise when that's not always possible at all. But the big difference between aggression and assertiveness is that if you're being assertive, you're respecting the other person, their own individuality.
And you're not taking their free will away from them. Sometimes anger can take other people's free will, and sometimes if you're angry, you can take your own free will, because your anger has hold of you. And assertiveness is that more effective way of getting what you need to do, but with love. And that's how I kind of perceive it, is that assertiveness is loving anger, and love and productive anger, because you're not disrespecting anyone. You're not putting so if you think of everything as someone's like little toy monkey, you're not giving that person your monkey, and you're saying, I'm angry, therefore have my monkey. You're saying, I'm going to keep my monkey, you have your monkey, and we're going to make our monkeys friends. So yeah,
it's a nice way of looking at it. I like that. So coming on to another misconception as well, men are angrier than women.
Nah.
In a single word, nah. I think that, a lot of the time it just comes back to that idea that people have around anger, isn't it? Yeah. It might be more obvious when men are angry. That I believe.
I think men generally, not always, are more physically angry, but in my experience in life is that women can be more passively aggressive, and not always, but I think women use their words as anger, and men use their bodies as anger.
I mean, of course, we are generalizing here. We have to recognize that. But I think it's a fair generalization to make. You're absolutely spot on. Men are more likely to be direct in their anger. They don't necessarily always beat about the bush. They might tell you what the issue is and have that kind of more idea of being verbally aggressive, sometimes physically aggressive. And again, a generalization, I don't want to dig myself a hole here, but generally speaking, women can be more indirectly aggressive. And something that's been noted as well, when we're talking about indirect aggression, regardless of your gender, it looks more like withdrawing affection potentially, or like you say, punishment. Exactly, without necessarily having that same direct kind of communication.
And I think you have to kind of look at the gender roles in that as well. I think that plays a massive part in how people construct their anger. I think that when you're a woman, like for example, in my perspective, I think it's a lot more accepted for women to be the passive driver, and that not, and this is wrong, I think that women should be able to be equally as strong, but it's about that expectation that society puts on us. It's not feminine to be angry, it's not feminine to shout at people, it's not feminine to express your rage. So you have to find like acceptable ways to express that anger in society, and it's the opposite for men. It's more acceptable to express your anger through what looks like rage, where and less
to kind of stereotypical view of like a silverback alpha or whatever. You're absolutely right. I think gender roles and societal expectations and these constructs as well can play a huge way in the way that people express anger. But it doesn't just stick with genders as well, you know, in families as well, because we pick up expectations from all over the shop. You know, I know that in a lot of families it can be discouraged as well to show anger or emotions, and that's when we might still have that anger, because we're human and we all do feel anger, but we're more likely to internalize and suppress it as well. Just the last point that I think we'll hit on before we move on. People say what they mean when they're angry. No, please don't believe that for a second. I know the way that I like to think about anger, it's a little bit like being drunk is what it is. Your brain is hijacked, you're not making much sense, the red mist has descended, and unfortunately, well, I know this is the case, I think people very rarely make wise decisions when they're actually fully in that anger.
In any emotion, really.
Yeah, in any emotion, exactly. So please, if you're dealing with someone that does struggle with anger, it's always wise to remember that they probably don't necessarily mean exactly what it is that they are saying at that point in time.
But that doesn't mean that it hurts less, and that doesn't mean that the effect of your mental illness, that say you're in a relationship with someone who's angry and that you believe that they don't mean what they say, that doesn't take away the pain that it holds
really
on
good
you
point.
When they're angry, because you're only reacting to what you're being told. So it's hard. Yeah, it is hard. It's a complex emotion.
It is, but also just the both sides of that as well. Of course, don't take away from your own feelings from that response to anger, but please, it's worth acknowledging as well. But although the person that's angry might be saying something that might not be entirely accurate, they themselves are also going through suffering as well. And that can help to soften the blow a little bit, to find a bit of compassion sometimes, which is really hard when people are angry.
The most important thing about addressing someone who has high anger is compassion and understanding, but also boundaries. I think that because anger is such an unbound emotion, you have to kind of force the boundaries in a healthy way.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it kind of ties in really nicely to this next question, actually. Not just the mention of boundaries, but the recognition that anger is there for a reason. It's trying to communicate something. Sometimes we don't necessarily understand what that message is, but there is something wrong. And this isn't often understood about anger, but anger might be the primary emotion, the one that we can see on the surface, the one that we're feeling, the one that we might feel in ourselves or observe in other people. But often it's an iceberg. If you can imagine an iceberg going along, you just see that little tip above the water there, that would be anger. But underneath the surface, there is a whole host of other stuff going on.
Experiences, emotions, things that you've learned.
My goodness,
it's just so complicated.
It's incredibly complicated, and this is why mental health isn't necessarily easy.
And that's why it's so difficult to manage your anger, because you think, I'm on track, I'm managing my anger, and then something else, a bit of that glitter comes back, and you're like, oh, this isn't even anger, this is just such deep sadness, or this is grief, or this is betrayal, or anything like that. It's kind of, you have to look at it from the bigger picture. You know how we always at Ethiopia we always say like take baby steps, but I think with anger it's kind of like look at it, take a step back, look at it from everything, and then address one thing at a time. So address one emotion, and then when you address all the things under the iceberg, the top of the iceberg starts to melt a little bit.
Exactly. I like that analogy. It starts to melt. I think this is the duty that we owe ourselves, especially when we're looking at anger. We want to take ourselves along a journey where we're doing that introspective work.
Yeah.
We're reflecting, we're looking under the surface one small bit at a time. Don't look at the whole picture, that can be too much as well. But gently extracting the underlying issues. Is it a trigger? Something that's happened really recently that's causing this anger? Is it a past experience, something potentially a few years back? Is it that you're not living up to your own hopes and expectations? Is it that you're falling outside of expectations that you've carried from somewhere else? Potentially. And when we can understand and address that, we can reconnect with our true selves. And when we reconnect with our true selves, when we get authentic, and that's a whole separate conversation, that's when what we will find is a lot of our mental health issues do kind of start to dwindle into the background. But coming back to this for now, just the anger and emotions, usually it's not just anger, there are loads of different emotions going on. Can you think of a couple?
Sadness. Grief. Is grief an emotion? I'm not sure.
Grief is closely linked to sadness and depression. They can get quite confusing. Separate conversation.
And also betrayal and anxiety as well, and feeling protective as well. It's quite a lot of those things are you trying to protect yourself, and that feeling of protecting others is what can evoke arguments quite a lot of the time, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely spot on. You know, just to name a couple, like you said, you know, you've got sadness, but you've got upset, frustration, low level anger. It can topple over into anger. But we've got things like stress, shame, guilt, hurt, loss, comes in insecurity. Yeah, a lot of the time, insecurity. A lot of the time, if we're feeling insecure, we can actually project, rather than actually acknowledge the insecurity that we have, we can kind of mask that with anger.
Make it happen, don't you? If you're feeling insecure and you lash out, then you more often than not prove yourself right, and then that then solidifies that belief.
It does. Yeah, exactly. If we're buying into our anger, it might actually compound the issue, revalidate our feelings of worthlessness potentially, and that is
a big feeling.
Yeah, and it's a large part of the cycle of depression as well. Yeah. So anger, again, we're recognizing that it's just an absolutely gigantic topic, and I'm mindful that, of course, we had a little bit of a bumpy start with the live, with the internet connection, but what I think we'll do, we'll spend a little bit longer on this topic, just where it is important, and what I want to spend just the next 5-10 minutes or so just loosely discussing is solutions. What is it potentially that we can do to start to master our anger? So I'm going to start with a little bit of a process here. Every time that we feel an emotion, there is just a very small process that happens. There is a trigger. So that trigger can be a thought, it can be a place, it can be a sound, it can be a person, it can be the past potentially as well. Then there is a processing or evaluation time. Then the emotion kicks in, and then after we feel that emotion, we have our emotional response, which is when we might act out, we choose a behavior, we withdraw affection, we might turn it inwards and do a bit of self-sabotage as well. So when it comes to mastering anger, the way that I like to look at it is we can kind of pick apart that process and have a look at every different phase and see what can we do around it. The nice thing is, if there are triggers that cause our anger, it's a really simple way of looking at it, but we have one of 3 options. Take that trigger out of our life. If you can do that practically, do that. Yeah, really simple. I'm getting quite upset about politics at the minute. I'm not going to take it down that direction. I'm taking myself away from the news, is what I'm doing. Easy, trigger gone. I can still live on and be happy. But if I had road rage, it's not really practical for me to take every...
Get out your car, can you?
No, probably not a good idea. Don't get out your car, and you certainly can't wish that every other car in the UK just takes itself off the roads as well.
Yeah.
Not practical, not going to happen. So when it comes to a trigger, you can remove it, you can look to change your response to that trigger, or accept it.
And when you read, if you've ever read The Power of Now, you'll see that a lot of our suffering is resistance to change. And I think a lot of anger is resistance to change sometimes.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Hanging on to the past as well, and our rejection of the reality that we're being faced with as well.
Yeah, and accepting things that are happening the way that they are, and they're rubbish, and that they hurt, but there's nothing that you can do. And it comes down to what we always say is, what are you in control of and what are you not in control of? And then if you can accept the situation, then you're going to look at it with more peace.
Yeah, exactly. Acceptance. Oh, there's this old saying, and I'm going to try and remember it off the top of my head, but suffering is your pain plus your non-acceptance of the pain.
Yeah.
So you're already feeling something, you're already going through a tough time, but the more that you reject that, the more pain you're causing yourself.
100%.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah.
It's good. Anyway, moving on, solutions wise, we also have negative thoughts. So we have to recognize that our thinking a lot of the time can be responsible for us landing ourselves in anger. And it's really important for us to notice where it is that we're putting our focus and our attention.
There's two things, isn't there? There's what you focus on expands, and what happened and what did you make it mean.
Oh, very nice. Good.
So yeah, that's something how I now live my life by. Every single thing that happens to me, I'm like, okay, what happened and what did I make it mean? So how did my lens on the world make this situation how I perceived it? And if someone else was to experience this exact same thing, how might they perceive it? And then weighing up the pros and the cons of that process, and thinking, just because I've attached my negative thoughts or my experience of life to the situation, that doesn't mean that that's the fact and that's how it happened and that's what was meant by the situation. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. It's worth saying that this is a really complicated topic at the same time. And for what it's worth, I will say in emotional regulation, whether we're doing a public live on it or whether we're doing our workshops in house, we spend more time looking at that. But yeah, taking responsibility for sometimes the way our own interpretation, the way we interpret an event and make it mean something that it might not be, can affect us in getting into anger.
Yeah.
Just an example around that, coming back to queue jumping. Let's say that we were in a queue together, and I don't know your feelings on queue jumping, but we'll say that you're chill about it just for the sake of this argument. I'm not, you are. Somebody jumps the queue. You stay serene, graceful, happy, content. I go into a deep rage because I've made it mean things like that person doesn't respect me.
Mm-hmm.
That person is incredibly selfish.
Yeah.
And that's where I'm putting my focus, and suddenly it expands, becomes a whole issue.
Yeah.
So the solution in this kind of context here is to take a notice of our thinking and also to redirect it. We don't necessarily control all the thoughts that pop into our heads, but we do control how much time we give them and where we put our focus.
Yeah.
Just moving on, we have emotional response. And this one's a little bit trickier, but what we're talking about when we're discussing our emotional response is just allowing ourselves potentially to feel that emotion.
Yeah.
Coming back to, I think we've discussed it already, but sometimes that non-acceptance of the emotion itself can be a really big part of the issue.
And something that I've learned quite recently is to do with emotional response, and that coming back to that negative thoughts as well, is sometimes it can be really good to give yourself 1 hour in the day to feel all of those negative emotions, but just sit with them and just say, okay, why am I feeling this? I've got 60 minutes to really work out what I'm feeling, how this has made me feel, what it provokes for me, what do I want to do, and then hour, not letting yourself feel that and act on that, because sometimes we can get so wrapped up in our emotions and so focused and almost obsessed about what we should be doing or what we shouldn't be doing, and it overtakes everything. Whereas if you kind of structure yourself and you are disciplined with yourself and you're saying, okay, I'm not going to let this anger take over my whole entire day. I'm going to let myself have 1 hour where I can just be really angry and I can just sit with that, and I'm not going to do anything, and I'm not going to put that anger on anybody else. I'm going to put that anger in this 1 hour, and then say, okay, time's up. I'm going to go and do something more productive. And I found that really helpful, not just in anger, but in any emotion, because it gives you that release, and also it gives you that break from it consuming you. But it can be really difficult, and it does take a lot of discipline, and it does take that acceptance that you can feel angry and not do anything about it.
Exactly, and it is a tough skill to master, like you say. But in particular, giving yourself that time during the day where you're allowed to feel things, I think is a really good way. But as well, extending, and this is also hard as well, but being compassionate to yourself during that time. There's one of my favourite things that I've heard in the last year or so is investigate with kindness. And I think we really owe it to ourselves as well. The same way that we might support another person if we notice they were angry, help them to get to the bottom of it. What is that underlying issue? Applying that rule to ourselves as well. Just allowing ourselves to feel, to observe, not to act necessarily on some of the impulses that we'll have, but to understand and explore with kindness. So, just a couple of other things that we will mention as well around solutions, of course. We can look to manage the physical symptoms as well. And that, I'll describe this one really quickly, because I think it's something that's talked a lot about in mental health. But, we're talking about deep breathing, for instance, making sure that our breath comes back into balance as well. We might also be talking about going for a walk as well.
Burning that adrenaline away.
Exactly. Not with a punching bag, as we discussed.
No.
Not that way. Healthily, exactly. You might practice some mindfulness as well. So reconnecting with the present moment, because often it's when we're locked up here that we're causing ourselves some issues. And also using positive distraction. But the final solution that I'd like us to focus on is that behavioural response as well. Because often in our response to anger lies our freedom. And we can have a few options. We can do that positive distraction, we can go for a walk, we can do that self-reflection as well, understand ourselves better and act in line with the message that it's sending. But in our response to anger lies our freedom. And ultimately, when the time is right, when it's not hijacking us, when it's not commanding our behavior, we want to take steps towards getting that problem out of our lives.
I think it can be quite I don't want to say embarrassing, but it can be quite a stigmatized emotion, because it's perceived as a negative emotion, and people can sometimes find it quite difficult to reach out for help and say, I'm really struggling to maintain my anger and to keep it at that frustration level and not let it escalate to unhealthy anger. But I think it's just really important to note that it is a feeling that every single human being feels. It just looks different, and it's one of the most freeing experiences to let go of that anger, I think, because it is an untamable beast sometimes, especially
Does
when
feel like it.
it when you feel like you're juggling so many balls and anger is one of them. It can be quite difficult to reach out for help, but it is worth it, and it is one of the best things that you could probably do for your mental health.
I would agree. And just on that note, like you say, it is a central piece of the puzzle. And you mentioned reaching out for support can be really important. And I would just like to say that if you are, of course, a resident of the Isle of Wight and you're not already under our service, getting in contact with us could potentially be an option, because we do run an anger management workshop. Today has just been a whistle-stop tour, really, about some of the things that we'd like to discuss in a lot more depth with our members in-house. But if you do feel that you or someone that you care for might be struggling, consider giving us a call on 01983 217 791, and we'll be here on the other end of the phone, potentially to invite you in to get that support that you might need. Okay, just a little takeaway message from today. Anger is a normal, healthy emotion. However, when it overwhelms us, it can prove to be an untamable beast, a destructive force of nature. Understanding this, it then becomes our duty to better understand the sources of our anger, to soothe it and to use it for its intended purpose, to create positive change in our lives. In our response to anger lies the power to dictate our future, and through mastery of our anger, we can reach the greatest goal of all, the freedom to be. On that note, Thank you very much for joining. I hope you've enjoyed today's live. And otherwise, we'll be running another live, not tomorrow, but the Friday after that at 1 p.m. We'll look forward to seeing you then.